Female reproductive endocrinology and cycling is quite an interesting feat. It has a lot of little mechanisms that just go, whoa, that really just happened? Whoa, that really just happened? Holy cow! Well, in order to make this subject as easy as possible, I've gone ahead and developed two things. And we should begin first off by discussing the two ways in which we can monitor and look at the female reproductive cycle. We can talk about the ovarian cycle, which we talked about recently in our first video of the female reproductive system, our introduction, in which a primordial follicle will eventually become a primary, secondary, and eventually mature, where it ovulates and it leaves behind this corpus luteum. If the egg isn't fertilized, the corpus luteum will eventually deteriorate into a corpus albicans. We can also talk about the female reproductive cycle with respect to the uterine menstrual cycle, aka building up of tissue and if the female reproductive cycle or the oocyte is not fertilized, the eventual menstruation. Menstruation is just referring to when a female sheds off a portion of the uterine tissue or that is unused. Excuse me. So there's a wordy way of what I just said. So there's lots of hormones that play a role in determining when and what happens. Both follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, which played a role in the male reproductive system, also has a role in the female reproductive system with the development of the follicle, hence the name follicle stimulating hormone, and to its development, as well as the luteinizing hormone, which induces ovulation and helps maintain that corpus luteum. The hormones produced by these, the estrogen, the inhibins, the progesterones, the relaxants, and inhibins, can all have negative feedback onto these follicle stimulating hormones and luteinizing hormones and all that stuff, except for in one point, which we will discuss here in a little while. So we do need to divide this up into four phases: the menstruation, pre-ovulatory, ovulatory, and post-ovulatory, all of which can occur between 24 and 36 days, depending upon genetics, depending upon if there are any type of contraceptives being taken at the time. It just depends varyingly upon the individual. So again, there's our female reproductive system being intermingled once the ovaries having an effect on the uterus, and the uterus having a little effect, if any, depending on if the egg was fertilized or not, back on the ovary. You will notice that estrogens come along and cause the proliferative phase, induce the growth of the endometrium, or it causes the growth of this endometrium. Estrogens help the growth and preparation of it, while progesterone sort of sets it up for the secretory phase. So estrogen is like the concert crew. They're setting up all the lights and the stage effects and all that stuff and making things work great. And then progesterone's there doing the performance of her life, going la. Yeah, and it has to sing too because, yeah, reasons. Anyways, progesterone is there inducing or taking advantage of what the proliferative phase has set up. It's secreting, it's supporting, it's sending out signals to the appropriate places. It's trying to induce implantation. Again, implantation is the one where it actually the oocyte, the fertilized egg, actually invades into the endometrium. If that doesn't happen and this corpus luteum dies off, turns into a corpus albicans, then menstruation occurs. You slough off all of this lining, which, to be honest, is really kind of odd. You see it in dogs, you see it a little bit in cats, you see it in humans and primates, but that's pretty much it. Most other mammalian creatures don't see it. Really smart as losing all these resources out of the body. You're losing blood, you're losing proteins and fats. It's just not a good idea. It's usually just reabsorbed in those other animals like rats and other and lots of other different mammals. Anyways, I digress. I don't mean to get into the mammalian. And what we're going to do, we're going to demonstrate and talk a little bit more on how all these hormones interact and move within this 24 to 36 day period, with the 28-day average we're going to be focusing on. And hopefully we can make this make sense. So first off, we do have the follicle stimulating hormone, the luteinizing hormone, coming from the pituitary. It's coming down and it's interacting with the ovary. You can see that follicle stimulating hormone has raised up but then starts dropping down. If you remember from our discussion earlier, remember that those primordial follicles, some of these guys don't exist. Most of them die off. This is why that follicle stimulating hormone comes along and releases and develops these things, and these follicles start releasing estrogen. Estrogen here is inhibitory. It inhibits follicle stimulating hormone. So estrogen is released out into the blood and shuts off follicle stimulating hormone, which means if these guys can't function or haven't built up themselves enough resources, they're not going to develop well enough, and they're going to cancel and degrade. So as these mature follicles keep on growing and releasing more and more estrogens, these follicle stimulating hormones keeps on dropping until finally you get to a point where estrogen is so high that it has the reverse effect. It has a positive feedback. The estrogen becomes positive and induces follicle stimulating hormone. So that's how follicles survive. They have to, if they have the right resources, if they're producing enough estrogen, and if they found the right connections with the blood vessels, then they're going to do great. If they don't, then they're going to fail miserably, which most of the class doesn't do. So only the best equipped follicles survive. Again, if we take a look at the pre-ovulatory phase, what's going up during that time? Not follicle stimulating hormone, it's going down. Estrogen is going up. So as estrogen goes up, proliferative phase goes up. That pre-ovulatory, there's ovulation, hence pre-ovulatory, before ovulation. You see a proliferative phase. Now, high estrogen also has a positive feedback on luteinizing hormone. And LH, this is where the name comes from. It luteinizes. The corpus luteum is formed by luteinizing hormone. Right there. So luteinizing hormone increases and induces ovulation. So here's more of a graphic that helps determine what's going on here, so that almost mature Graphian is really, really sticking up, and tons and tons of estrogen that it finally has stimulated luteinizing hormone. It's increased the release of follicle stimulating hormone, and it induces the ovulation, which leaves behind a luteinized cell, a corpus luteum, a body of luteinized cells, hence luteinizing hormone. After the corpus luteum is left behind, it starts producing a new hormone. It not only produces estrogen, but it also produces something called progesterone. Remember that progesterone, at the same time, you should be noticing here something. The secretory phase is happening the same time the progesterone is happening. What does that suggest to you about progesterone? Hopefully it suggests to you that progesterone induces the secretory phase. So let's do a quick concept check. Follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone. Follicle stimulating hormone is inducing the formation of these new during the follicular phase, the development of the follicle, which in turn the follicle releases estrogen, which is negative up to a negative feedback loop on luteinizing hormone and follicular stimulating hormone to a point. But it also induces the proliferation or the growth of that endometrium. After a certain point, after estrogen has gotten so high in levels that it becomes a positive feedback loop to follicular stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone. Luteinizing hormone gets released and induces the mature cell to rupture or ovulate. at day 14. Once that happens, that corpus luteum that's left behind, estrogen starts coming back up a little bit, but most importantly, progesterone starts going up a lot. And it causes that secretory phase. Progesterone also, a lot of you might have heard this, progesterone is the hormone of pregnancy. Progesterone levels have to be maintained in order for that the pregnancy to be maintained. If you don't maintain progesterone, you get menstruation. You lose. You have a spontaneous abortion, it's called. So here is a little graph that they had provided in the book. You can see that the follicle stimulating hormone has something to do with the maturation of the follicle as well as the proliferation of the endometrium. At a certain point, when the mature follicle has produced so much estrogen that it now has a positive effect, it can induce the increase in FSH-LH, which induces ovulation eventually, which the structure left behind, that corpus luteum, can then induce and release progesterone, which is the hormone of pregnancy, which will induce the secretory phase. If that corpus luteum finally dies off, you get menstruation. So that feedback is super important in regulating that hormonal activity. And since we understand this stuff now, we can really use a lot of it for contraceptives. So this hormonal method that I'm talking about, we're looking at birth control now. I'm going to go ahead and bridge into the hormonal methods. Hopefully you can see that you can trick the body into thinking that it's pregnant and make it think that we don't really need any follicles to be released. So if you give somebody a vaginal ring, if you give the oral contraceptives or what have you, you're basically popping progesterone, which tricks your body into thinking that the female is pregnant, therefore follicles should not be released. Obviously, with that, you do have to remove the vaginal ring. You do have to allow the oral contraceptives to stop so that the female can menstruate and release that follicle. You need to have that natural rhythm going on. But if you're not into the thought of taking oral contraceptives, if you're not interested in doing a vaginal ring, then there are other things that are available that don't take advantage of that hormonal control. You have surgical sterilization as well as periodic abstinence. Periodic abstinence, we can flip back to the cycles and we can see when abstinence should occur. If a female menstruates, then abstinence usually then sexual activity can usually occur for the first 2 or 3, 4 days. Obviously, you do not want to wait until 14 days after the menstruation cycle occurs, because that's when a new follicle is created, and sperm can last longer, sometimes last as long as 5 days, but even longer. Thus, abstinence probably isn't the best way of having some type of regulation. Surgical sterilization has been found to have almost 100% reliance. So the removal, or the point that I want to point out, is the surgical removal or surgical sterilization. In the males, it's called a vasectomy, where you tie the tubes of the vas deferens so that sperm can't come out. And some of you might be wondering, hey, wait a minute, how is that not 100% effective? Well, sometimes, a doctor forgets to warn them that those tubes can be filled with male gametes still. And that could be on the upper portion of it. So a guy goes home and says, you know what? I've been too tied. I no longer can cause anyone to be pregnant. So they go home. They have sexual intercourse. They have intercourse. But because those tubes still have that sperm, it still sneaks in, and voila, you have a baby. It's a miracle baby. And daddy starts wondering if it's truly his baby if mommy's pregnant all of a sudden. In females, the males, really, it's the easiest thing to do. The tubes are out. They're right there. Just have to open the scrotum, tie them up, reseal it back up. You can keep everything in place. Ejaculation can still occur, but it will be absent. Sperm will be absent after about 10 to 15 days. Females is a lot harder. You have to go into the abdominal pelvic region, get the tubes for tubular ligation. That's just tying the tubes closed. You could also do a method in which you insert a metal hook into the uterine tube that causes a scar tissue to build up, which blocks off the tube. We talked about those. There's other ways. There's the non-oral methods that you could also do. There's the emergency, the morning after pill, emergency contraception, where it sort of tries to abort the child, or any fertilized thing. You could also have a physical barrier, such as a male condom, a vaginal pouch, a diaphragm, cervical cap. Abstinence obviously isn't the very best at its rates. Take a look-see at this. You can see the vasectomy does pretty good at 99.9% sterility, no babies being made. The tubular ligation having a little less effective way. But if you look down here on the periodic abstinence, you're still getting 9, even if they use it perfectly, you're still getting a 9% pregnancy rate, as well as a 25% not really well practiced. Still better than no method at all, as if you're trying to get pregnant. But still, the condom, the vaginal, with the male condom, if you're looking for barrier types of contraceptives, is probably the best of the four of the barriers. Spermicides, which usually are accompanied on male condoms, and all these different barriers by alone aren't that effective. You might as well just be practicing arithmetic abstinence. And with that, I do believe that is almost all. We need to talk about abortion, forgive me. There is a spontaneous abortion, which I kind of hinted towards, about the progesterone just going down, but usually it's just, sometimes we don't know why it happens. A female wants to have a child. She's pregnant, and all of a sudden 2 months, 3 months later, she loses the child. And no fault of her own, most likely. Then there's the ones that are induced, which is usually you can do two things, which is a hormone where it blocks progestin. Remember that progesterone is the one that makes you think that you're pregnant. If you block progesterone signals, the body thinks, I'm not pregnant. Well, that's weird. And it releases everything. It sloughs off everything you go through menstruation. If the baby is a little bit larger, you could do a vacuum aspiration, which will remove all the other stuff as well. Late stage abortion is highly unrecommended because it can have complications to it, but it can be done. You can do induced abortion. You can do surgical methods. With that is birth control. We don't need to really go much into the development of the male-female reproductive system. Just know and be familiar with the analogous structures, and you'll be safe. If you want an explanation as to why they're the analogous structures, then I would go ahead and dive into this developmental portion of the reproductive system. With that is it. I hope you all have a wonderful week, and props to you.